Good morning, everyone. It's Monday morning at 10 o'clock, so time for another Just Ask Jess. I'll give it a minute or two and see if I get joined by anybody. But the topic for this morning is actually around focus, but not focus as we've talked about before, which is to do with how you maximize your concentration and your ability to get work done. This morning I want to talk about focus in terms of where we direct our attention and our thoughts, and the importance and significance of being aware of that as we go about our daily business, and particularly now with COVID and everything else on the go. So I don't know if anybody else has a bit of COVID fatigue going on. I know I do. But it is the reality that we're living in. And when we talk about this morning applies in that regard as much as it does if we didn't have a pandemic going on. It's just an important and helpful thing to understand about how your brain works. So what we talk about is the notion of what you focus on, you get more of. Right? So I'm going to say that again. What you focus on, you get more of. And that's partly to do with how your brain works. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. But that's really important, because if you stop and think about it, you are in charge of creating your own reality. You are in charge of creating the way that you respond and react to the things around you based on how you think. So your thoughts wire your brain, and your brain creates your thoughts. So it's like a repetitive loop. So being really conscious of how we shape our thoughts can shape our brain, and then we have a very different response and reaction to things. So let's talk about that a little bit. So every time you have an experience or a thought, you create a pathway in your brain. And so what we talk about in the neuroscience world is neurons, or brain cells, neurons that fire together, wire together. All right. So the idea being that your experiences, your thoughts, create that connection in your head, and you create a new pathway or a new connection in your brain. And the more that you reiterate that experience, or you reiterate that thought, the stronger that connection between the neurons becomes. So if it's something that you do all the time, eventually the pathway is almost as strong as it can be. So a good example of that is reciting the alphabet. Most of us can merrily recite the alphabet without too much trouble. And that's not because you were born being able to recite the alphabet. It's because you sang it and did it at school and did stuff with it as you were a kid and repeated it over and over and over enough that connection is extremely well formed in your brain. And the example I often use too is essentially driving to work. So a lot of us aren't driving right now, but when we were, driving to work is one of those things that often you'd get to your destination and go, I don't actually remember doing this. I don't know how I actually did this. And that's because you've done that action so many times that the neurons in your brain fired together and wired together, and then that connection became deeper and deeper and deeper. And so we are actually capable, through our experiences and our thoughts, in shaping the connections we have in our brain. And that means you're capable of shaping the way you react and respond to things too. So it's an active process. Now, that's a little unusual for people to think about. We often thought about, how do I mould my body? How do I build my muscles? How do I shape the physical side of me? We haven't often talked about doing the same thing with your brain. But every time you have a thought and every time you have an experience, you deepen a set of connections in your brain. So then it becomes really important to think about the quality of those connections. What is it you are teaching yourself to have as an experience? What is the quality of the connection that you are building in your brain? If you are constantly focusing on negative things, or having negative experiences, or dwelling on negative thoughts, you are going to be reinforcing those connections and patterns in your brain rather than positive ones. And so that's where we get the idea of what you focus on, you get more of. And so the opposite becomes true. If we can practice, if we can form thoughts and experiences that are positive, we can shape the habits and reactions in a positive way for our brain. So therefore, what you focus on, you get more of. You'll get more of a positive thing. right? So that's what we're talking about. And so for me, that's important in two ways. It's important for us generally to think about, where do you default to? Where, as a human being, what are those voices or nagging thoughts that come back over and over and over again? Because those are connections that have become formed in your brain because of your thoughts or your experiences. How can you shift and change those things so that you have a different approach or a different mentality? And right now, particularly with COVID going on, what you focus on, you get more of. So if you're telling your head, if you're focusing on the negative aspects of the pandemic, if you're focusing on a negative experience, if the thoughts that go through your brain are ones about how bad it is and all the awful things that are going on, that is the connection that you are reinforcing. And so it becomes important to think about, how do I create a positive version of that? So what does that look like? Well, there's three things I can share around that. So the first is to think about self-talk, the quality of your self-talk. What are the things that go through your head that are forming and, wiring those neurons together? And how can you practice changing those thoughts or have affirmations that are more positive versions for your brain, so that rather than forming a connection around a negative thought, you are forming a connection around a positive one. So, some of that's tied to things like growth mindset. So if you make a mistake in something, rather than thinking, Jesus, I'm terrible at that, or, oh, that's atrocious, I'm never going to learn that, which over time becomes a wired response in your brain, stopping to think, okay, that's an opportunity for me to practice, or I haven't learned to do that yet, right? It's a different way of thinking about yourself and wiring the connections in your brain. And I am constantly amazed, and I'm guilty of it too, when you talk to people about the voices in their heads and the things that they say to themselves, we say far more degrading and mean things to ourselves than we would ever dream of saying to somebody else, and yet we still do it. So really checking ourselves on the quality of our self-talk and saying, is that really a connection that I want to have wedged in my brain, or do I want to create a more positive tone or comment that is wired into my head? So that's the first thing. The second thing for me is around gratitude practice. So if what you focus on you get more of, we need to start thinking about the good stuff, right? So things like gratitude practice, which is what it sounds like, taking time in your day to pause and think about what you're grateful for, is going to constantly start forming those connections around good things, right? You're teaching your brain to look for the good stuff, and those connections become the ones that are formed, and those connections become the ones that you fall back on, right? So that time each day to practice, what am I grateful for, or what's happened today that's good, is going to form positive connections in your brain. So that would be the second thing. So the first one would be quality of self-talk. The second one would be around gratitude practice. I'll call it gratitude practice. And the third thing that can help us is to practice reframing. So reframing is the idea of taking the lens that we currently have on a situation and flipping it to a different perspective, right? So the simple one that's very clear, that's going around on Facebook right now, is the meme around shifting your mindset from stuck at home to safe at home. So one of those, stuck at home, has negative connotations and will engender feelings of anxiety and frustration. The other is a positive iteration of the current circumstances and will engender feelings usually of comfort, right, and safety. And so it's wiring your brain around the same situation but to have a different response. And that's what reframing is about. It's about checking that what goes off in your head in a situation, and rather than repeating all the negative around it, it's finding ways to think about or change the lens or the perspective. And so sometimes that can be thinking about it in terms of, well, how would I explain this to a child? Because likely you would explain it differently. What would somebody I know who's really positive say about this? What's the opportunity in this? So it's really challenging you to change the lens so that you wire a different set of connections into your brain. So that's really what I want to talk about today. Like last week, we talked about the whole premise of mental wellness and the healthy mind platter and some of the things that you can do on an ongoing basis to really support your ongoing mental wellness. For me, this notion of taking control of our own focus, right? What you focus on, you get more of. We can shape and adjust how we see the world by focusing on our thoughts and our experiences. And that for me is a really powerful thing when you start to get to grips with it. So what you focus on, you get more of. Start paying attention to where your head goes, what your lens is, what other thoughts that run through your head, and if they need adjusting, adjust them, because you have the control over doing that. And in this situation, when you find yourself in that place where you're thinking the negative things about what's going on, how can you reframe that to positive? What can you see that you're grateful and appreciative of? Those things will help you form more positive wiring in your head that will help you on an ongoing basis. So hopefully that's helpful for everybody when you get a chance to tune into this. If there are any questions on any of this after today, as always, we're here. Feel free to drop us a note, send us an email. You can reach the team at contact@e3.ca, and I'm happy to share anything that's going to help really in this situation. We're all in this together. There's no such thing as anybody getting missed out of the wonderful world of COVID. So be well, be safe, be healthy, maintain your connections, get enough sleep, and I will see you again next Monday. Actually, next Monday is Victoria Day, so we're going to take the day off, so we won't have a video next Monday. We'll connect again the week after. If you have any topics you'd like me to cover when we reconnect, let me know, and I will weave them into our schedule. Right. Have a good week, everybody, and stay safe.